Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Australian Legal Sector Alliance Climate Action Roundtable. Thanks all for attending, and if I can start off by just saying that in the spirit of reconciliation, we'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people and of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we conduct our webinar today, and recognise the continuation of the cultural, spiritual and educational connection that Aboriginals and Indigenous people hold with the land. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people who are attending today. Just a little bit, let's start off with a little bit of housekeeping. We are holding this as a webinar, so your cameras and microphones are currently off, so it's going to be difficult for you to interact using your cameras and microphones as you would in a Teams meeting. But we have enabled the chat function and the reactions function, so I encourage you all to be generous with your chat and with your reactions so we can get some feedback as we go along. Use those buttons, see if you can wear them out as we go along. We'll also as we progress, we won't be taking questions during the presentation, but if you have a pressing question, please add it into the chat and we can insert the question as we go along. But at the end of the meeting, we will be reviewing the chat for questions, so please put your questions into the chat and we'll be pulling those questions out and answering them at the end of the session. We're recording this session as well, so please be aware that after this session, a video will be available and we'll distribute that to you. And also at the end of this meeting, when the meeting closes at 1 o'clock and many of you will have to go off, we'll be holding the meeting open, just so if you do have any further questions, please keep the chat going and we can use Chris's time as we go. I just want to tell you a little bit about the AusLSA Climate Action Roundtables before I introduce Chris. The objectives of the Climate Action Roundtables, AusLSA has arrived at a position where it believes that it's really in the best interests of law firms to start adopting leading practice climate change action programs. Our objectives and the objectives of these programs is really to convince you of the business merits to act quickly and decisively on climate change. And to do that by providing highlights of information and tools that you'll need to progress and to make that happen in your firm. So future sessions that we will be holding include things like how to build a robust science-based target, digging into that and having discussion on that, how to manage your greenhouse data appropriately so you've got the right information and you can actually report on and measure progress and targets. What sort of data and reporting clients might expect. We're seeing the clients are starting to expect that information at the moment. So what do they need? We'll be covering topics like how to purchase renewable electricity, how to reduce your travel emissions, how to convince others in your organisation to act, what data, what information, what sort of arguments to use. We'll be covering the purchase of offsets, the good, the bad and the ugly, and also the risks of offsets programs. The tools and programs that might be available to you to do that, and then things that can go wrong. And then we'll also be having practitioner discussions, which are more kind of interactive discussions that you can participate in and share your stories and your issues as well. So that's what's coming up with the Climate Active Roundtables. We're looking to have them at least 6 before the end of the year, probably more. So expect them to see every 6 to 8 weeks a new Climate Active Roundtable coming up dealing with one of those issues. We need anyone in your organisation or as part of your group who wants to attend these roundtables are very welcome to join, so please include them as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Wilson. Chris is is the Director of Sustainability Advisory Services at Pangolin Associates. He's more than that, he's one of the founders of Pangolin Associates. He has a deep involvement in the systems of sustainability, of monitoring and reporting, but he's a developer and provider of a suite of carbon advisory services, which he constructs and maintains the frameworks and management systems that deliver effective environmental outcomes and of efficiency gains, and has been doing so for the last 15 years. we're very lucky to have Chris on board, so I'll hand over to Chris, who'll tell you, I guess, a bit of a flyover, Chris, of kind of what the key issues are for organisations like law firms who are looking to either start to build or to improve their climate action programs. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Richard. Let me take over here.
Chris, you should be able to take over.
Yeah. Okay. So, everyone hear me okay, I hope? Thanks for that introduction, Richard. And as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about what effective climate action means and the sort of risks and opportunities that are in the climate landscape as it stands for organisations currently. I'll talk a bit about what a typical emissions profile looks like for the law firms that we've worked with so far. And I'll also be unpacking just a bit more about what the action areas you can use to address those emissions activities that are sort of more material in your inventory, and talking a bit about the I'll be talking a bit about some of the programs and resources that are available in this space as well. But just a bit more about us and what we do. So we are a climate active certified organisation and service. We've been carbon neutral since we began operations in 2010. We are certified auditors under the Clean Energy Regulator for those responsible for reporting under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. We have staff members with various skill sets and backgrounds, ranging from PhDs in chemical engineering to pure mathematics to marine biology. And we work with quite a broad cross-section of organisations across the economy. So just moving on to what effective climate action means. And I just wanted to, I guess, just introduce this concept of some of you, I guess a lot of people would be aware of the idea of carbon emissions and how they impact on the environment, but they may not be aware so much of the why is my screen blank? Sure. But what I was going to show there was, it's not coming up, is this idea of energy imbalance. So, the carbon emissions that we're emitting into the atmosphere are causing an imbalance in terms of the solar radiation coming into the atmosphere and the radiation that's able to go out of there. Yeah. So that one's working. But these, so essentially what we're doing is taking fossil fuels out of the biosphere, putting them into the atmosphere. That's causing these radiative forcing impacts that have various feedback mechanisms and leading to this energy imbalance, as I said, in the Earth's thermal equilibrium. So where is this radiative forcing coming from? And essentially it's coming from various human activities across agriculture, transport and industry, and the use of buildings in the built environment. And these lead to other impacts in connection to that. And then they go to, as I mentioned, these sort of feedback mechanisms in terms of loss of carbon sinks, both on land and in water, and additional greenhouse gases into the environment, which cause those radiative forcing. So just to give people a quick overview on how these are quantified in terms of the greenhouse gases, the way it's set up is that we look at these. I might just take my image out there if I can. I can't. Just go to content only. Yeah. So, and what we're talking about there is these kind of the differentiation between essentially the operations of an organisation and their value chain. So that goes both upstream and downstream. And this differentiation, in theory, allows for, you know, making sure that double counting doesn't occur when companies are accounting for the same emissions across different sectors. So essentially it boils down to scope 1, 2 and 3. And once we come up with that, what we need to keep in mind in terms of mitigation opportunities and climate action and reducing these is essentially a hierarchy of actions that, and this was released last year from the Science Based Target Initiative, which I'll talk more a bit about later, and I think you guys are having a session on that at another point in time. But what they've said is that the idea is that you're setting a short-term target with the goal of having a longer-term target further out in time, and that what you're trying to do along the way to those targets is reduce your absolute emissions and at the same time mitigating emissions beyond your value chain. And the way that's sort of couched and the discussions around that is essentially talking about compensation. So you generate emissions through your activities, through your value chain and your operations, and you compensate for them by going outside of your value chain and purchasing offsets, essentially projects. Eventually you want to reduce your reliance on those and get to a stage where your absolute emissions are as close as possible to net zero. So neutralising those residual emissions needs to come from sources that are actually removing carbon from the atmosphere rather than avoiding them, which is, we'll talk a bit more about this taxonomy of carbon offsets a bit further on. So a lot of, I guess, discussion around science-based targets and how it relates to global carbon emissions. But essentially, as I mentioned, there's a differentiation between having a near-term target, so within a 5 to 10 year trajectory, and making sure that that is on a line with getting to somewhere by 2050 that is in agreement with the 1.5 degree increase in global emissions above pre-industrial levels. So the idea is that if everybody's got this trajectory and they're all on the same pathway, then the economy as a whole globally will eventually get to net zero. And I guess it's important to keep in mind that what we're talking about here is global action, and any targets or goals that are set at a company level are really kind of in that context of a global action network. So a science-based target, as I mentioned, involves reducing your absolute emissions to get to a certain point in time. While you're doing that, you can mitigate your emissions beyond your value chain by investing in projects that occur elsewhere and that are having a net reduction in emissions overall. So again, I'll talk more about that later, about the taxonomy of those types of offsets. But you want to get to this point eventually where you've neutralised everything. And I guess this is the important differentiation between being carbon neutral and net zero as it's understood currently. The IPCC uses those terms interchangeably, but if we're talking about an organisation currently, you could see carbon neutrality now as a kind of a commitment or an annual goal to getting to that stage of eventually being net zero at some point in the future. So just looking at that from a graphical perspective, so if we think about the overall emissions of a company at a certain point in time in the baseline, then at 5 to 10 years, you're setting a target, an interim target, which gets you to a certain point. And then by 2050, you want to be a point where there's this balancing out of those residual emissions that you can't abate and the removal of carbon from the atmosphere through various mechanisms. And you can see there's the grey line beneath the x-axis there is talking about those beyond value chain emissions that, you know, companies currently invest in projects that relate to emissions avoidance or reductions in other areas. So, as I mentioned, there's a taxonomy that was generated by Oxford University a couple of years ago, and this talks about the sort of differentiation between those avoidance projects, which is essentially what the majority of offsets that are available in the current market are, and transitioning gradually to these removal projects, which are, you know, focused on technology that's still being developed in many ways, and there's not a lot of those permanent storage solutions getting to the far right side of that taxonomy that are available at this point in time. But the idea is that as we develop the research and development over time, that we'll get to that point where we are able to remove and permanently store carbon from the atmosphere at some point in time. So that's the idea, that it could eventually you'll be transitioning in that pathway. And I guess, you know, talking about, as Richard mentioned before, these risks of offsets, that's something you need to build into your strategic plan around potential exposure to not having that removal component when you need to get to the net zero aspect. And I'll just touch on some of those risks here. So obviously, you know, you want high quality offsets, and some of you may have seen in the press in the last couple of weeks some questions around the integrity of offset programs, particularly in Australia. And you know, that goes for other jurisdictions as well. One of the outcomes of the recent Conference of the Parties in Glasgow was an agreement around what's called Article 6, and that allows for companies to essentially use offsets that are generated in their jurisdictions for their own national targets. So that will change the landscape in terms of liquidity of the market, and will also, as those standards improve and become more mature, it will hopefully, the idea is that it will reduce the risk in terms of the integrity of those projects. So a lot of the projects that are available at the moment are quite old and were part of the previous Kyoto Protocol agreement around the Clean Development Mechanism. And there's probably questions around whether or not they are still actually contributing to reductions of emissions. There's some risks around reputation, greenwashing, etc. Supply is obviously a big issue. Again, there's been some press recently about the government in Australia freeing up some of the contracts that they had agreed to for carbon offset projects in Australia, which has translated into an increased supply and consequently a reduction in price. There's also opportunities in terms of developing renewable energy, greening of the grid in general. And what we're seeing as well for a lot of larger corporates is insetting. So this idea that you're bringing the carbon offset generation within your value chain. So essentially purchasing land and planting it out, or investing in technology that removes carbon from the atmosphere, and bringing that into your operational fold. So we'll talk more about programs and touch on the SBTI later on, but I'll just move on now to talk about law firm specific profiles. So we've worked with quite a large cross section of law firms, from the top tier all the way down to smaller and medium firms. And having done that for quite a few years now, we've built up a fairly large database, and we have a pretty good idea about what the most material emission sources are for most firms. So you can see here, we've got averages across all of those firms that we work with for all tiers. And it shows that by and large, most emissions are coming from the value chain, or scope 3 emissions. Electricity is certainly a big one, and a large contributor, particularly for organisations that have a large footprint in terms of office space. But these, these material emission sources do change over time, and as I mentioned, these profiles are for law firms that we've been working with for quite a few years, and there is some transitions there in terms of the boundary. So you can see there that employee commuting often makes quite a large contribution, and obviously with the changes over the last couple of years, people working from home more, that has reduced, but it's being compensated by working from home emissions related to people using power at home. So that's something that's not represented really in the data currently. We're also seeing, as people virtualise their emissions more and rely more on data services, that can be an increasingly large component, and it's not necessarily represented there in the categories. So if we think about the sort of benchmarks for the various tiers, you can see there that smaller law firms, have generally a much smaller footprint. Obviously, that increases as the firm gets larger in size. And these are benchmarked based on FTE, so the more employees you have, the lower that intensity is. So, it may be that mid-tier firms are a bit overrepresented in there because they have typically lower employees, but they have sometimes the same emissions, because, as I highlighted earlier, things like business flights and those value chain emissions are something that contribute to law firms sort of across those tiers. So that gives you a bit of a picture of the landscape, I guess, in terms of emission profiles for Australian law firms. And I'll just talk a bit about, I just want to unpack those emission categories that I mentioned are material for laws, and what are the actions you can actually take about that, and how do you address them? So I guess, the main message is to be strategic about it and have a plan in place, and a systematic framework for it. Setting a target's important, but also understanding how you're going to get to that target is equally important. Setting timeframes and achievable goals for getting there, allocating resources effectively is also important. Something that we're also seeing, and I guess this is something that gets teased out in the LSA reports, is those sort of broader SDGs and the governance and social aspects that are associated with these actions as well. But yeah, they need to align with both near-term targets and longer-term ones, and they need to be actions that are reviewed on a regular basis. So it's very important not to just think about this as a set and forget exercise, but something that needs to be constantly managed and monitored, and, as I mentioned, allocated resources for. So if we look at some of the examples, as I mentioned in that profile of the most material emission sources, business flights is one, which is, again, obviously something that's reduced a lot over the past couple of years, but will presumably ramp up again. And there's various actions you can take to address them. Some examples might be things like looking at aircraft companies and what they're doing to reduce those emissions. There's been a few trials currently around sustainable aviation fuels, which is promising. And so, looking at their profiles and what they're doing about their own footprints. Using hotels that have green accommodation as well. So just thinking about general, the emissions associated with travel. There's also, things like taxis and Ubers, etc., which do cause emissions. Setting a target for flights, which obviously can be a challenge when you have clients that are expecting you to meet, but that's less of a priority, I guess, nowadays, with video conferencing being what it is. The class of flights that you choose does make a difference. So if you take up more space on the plane, there's more emissions associated with that. So it's important to think about. And the legs, the amount of legs that you have in a flight also makes a difference. So planes burn more fuel on takeoff and landing than they do cruising at altitude. So it's important to take those into consideration as well. As I mentioned, another large contribution that we're seeing currently to organisational footprints is working from home. And there's a lot that can be done in terms of education there, trying to get people on board. And this is a broader, I guess, stakeholder engagement and change management piece. But they do often translate into actions at home. So encouraging green power purchasing, or incentivising staff to implement efficiency measures at home, or implement solar panels. There's a lot of changes in the electricity markets currently, which can be leveraged by larger organisations around virtual power plants, etc. And power purchase agreements as well can incorporate this component. So it's worth considering. There's lots of other opportunities in terms of waste management and consumables in the house, which are important to take into account. And this will often translate into, the organisation being more proactive, or engagement at staff at various levels, if they're reflecting those actions at home in the organisation as well. Food for some organisations can be large, particularly where they have catering in-house. So there's various levels to that, and there's, I guess, depending on the ingredients or the mix of food sources used, that can have quite a big impact on the carbon inventory. So it's worth considering things like taking meat out of the menu, at least occasionally. It can make a big dent. And I guess it's worth also talking just quickly about the sort of methodology behind these emission factors is often based on a dollar value. So the spend that you have for these food categories relates directly to emissions, and that's done from a top-down perspective. But if you can potentially do a bottom-up analysis, so talk to the caterers or the food suppliers about where they're getting their supplies from, then you can do a much more accurate emissions profile and come up with some numbers that are a bit more reflective, and also that can translate into a realisation of emissions reduction much more clearly when you're doing it from that perspective. So, just if we kind of categorise everything as food and catering, then that has a very high emission factor because we're taking into account sort of all of the emissions of the hospitality and catering industry and allocating them to an organisation based on their spend. But if we break that down further into discrete categories, then those emissions are a lot lower. And obviously plant-based foods have a lower impact than animal ones. There's also considerations around waste, even though it may be a lower impact in terms of carbon. It's something that's quite sort of tangible and visible to employees, so it's something that you can get a lot of engagement on typically. It's often something that's very hard for people to get good data on when you're in a multi-storey office building. All of the waste tends to get consolidated into one area, and it can be quite difficult to disaggregate that and allocate it to what your specific contribution is. So, a good way around that is to do a bit of a waste audit and think about the bins that you've got around the office area, trying to quantify the weight that's going in there and also the waste streams that are being used there. But also thinking about, if we go back to that discussion about the consumables that are used in terms of food, etc., thinking about how you can sort of close that loop. Previously, many years ago, there was a lot of people grappling with the issue of printing and having a lot of printing cartridges lying around, and that's as everyone's moved to digital documentation's become less of an issue. But a similar sort of theory applied that you could consume a resource, then send it back for processing and reconsume it again, rather than having a sort of a linear model. This idea of circularity is something that's quite important to get your head around, and is something that a lot of organisations are being very proactive about. A lot of it comes down to being proactive in terms of procurement. So as I highlighted before, a large chunk of emissions for law firms comes from your value chain, and that really comes down to suppliers and what they're doing about being more sustainable and lowering their impacts. So having requirements around that in your policy, do the suppliers measure their emissions? Do they have targets for reduction? Are they able to provide data? And do they have performance indicators around those data and improving that? So, just setting that up and setting the expectations at the contract level can make quite a big difference. So thinking about this, as a kind of an overarching strategy, as I mentioned, what you might come up with eventually is some sort of pathway that has various milestones along the way that are leading towards a target eventually of getting to an absolute reduction. So you can see a bit of an example here that this client has implemented or will implement, has reduction pathways in place, and they're incremental. Some of them have more of an impact than others, and some of them are more costly than others. So it's important to consider the timeframes, when they can be implemented, what impact they're going to have, and what changes are required to the way the business operates for them to be implemented effectively. So I might just move on now to some of those frameworks for setting goals and targets that are available publicly. There's quite a few of them, and it can be a bit of a minefield and difficult to know what to align with. As I mentioned, the kind of gold standard is the Science-Based Target Initiative, which, you know, really kind of is what aligns most closely with globally agreed climate reduction scenarios. And to be fair, it's quite a difficult commitment to make, because it does require those absolute reductions and lesser reliance on offsets eventually. And as I mentioned, those Scope 3 emission sources are the hardest to reduce. So, you know, understanding what that means for the business is quite critical before that commitment is set in place. There's also initiatives around renewable energy. So the RE100 initiative sets up a framework for organisations to procure 100% renewable electricity. And that's something that a lot of people are already well on the way to doing. People like Apple, Deloitte, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, a lot of the big players are already well on their way to doing that. Some broader frameworks, such as the UN Global Compact, are worth considering, and that looks at a range of different impacts, not just carbon. And then there's other more specific ones around, you know, climate pledging. These can be more or less restrictive in terms of what the requirements are, and oftentimes, you know, it's something that you can pledge to now and show your commitment to later on down the path. So that can be an appealing way for people to kind of gradually implement these types of programs. And as I mentioned, they can oftentimes result in fairly significant changes to the operations of an organisation. So they do take time to implement. So it can be worthwhile considering having a pledge in place, at least initially, or an agreement that you have a commitment to get towards at some point in the future. There's probably many people in the group that are already Climate Active certified, so I won't touch too much on that, but you know, it's an Australian government program that essentially gives you a certification for carbon neutrality. But as I mentioned, that's really kind of more about having an annual commitment to getting to a longer term target of net zero at some point in the future. And some other things to mention are, again, the UN has the Race to Zero. There is also another UN program called Climate Neutral Now, which a lot of companies are signing up for, which essentially gives you a logo once you submit your inventory. It's very similar to the Climate Active program, but it's not a standard that you can be certified against. essentially just gives you that recognition that you've measured your impacts and offset them and set a commitment to emissions reduction over time. And depending on the level of commitment you have, you get either a gold, a silver or a bronze logo. There's various building certifications. Again, I'm sure a lot of the people here today would be aware of things like Green Star and Neighbours. So that's something you can do at a tenancy level to reduce your emissions and, you know, get that sort of those operational impacts measured and monitored over time and to keep track of them. Something which we as an organisation signed up for quite early on was a benefit corporation, which essentially means that your business model is aligned to your social mission. So for us as an organisation, our mission when we started was to embed sustainability at every level of every organisation. And so we've made sure that our operations as an organisation are aligned to achieving that mission. So our mission is not so much about generating profit as a normal business driver, but more about having that purpose. So, and that's something that I mentioned before about that sustainable procurement policy. It's something that a lot of organisations built into that policy to look for organisations that are giving them goods and services that have that certification, because it essentially means that they are required to be ethical about what they do and to have some commitment to not just measuring and monitoring their environmental impacts, but also broader community outreach and governance metrics and looking after their workers in terms of diversity and inclusion, which can be very important considerations for a lot of organisations. So that's all I have to present on currently. So I'll hand it back to Richard. You want to? Have we got any questions?
If you can finish sharing your presentation, then we might jump into some questions.
Sure.
Just wait for that to. And maybe turn your camera on.
Yeah,
that's the case. All right. Thanks very much. That was. Thank you very much, Ian. Sorry for the little break there. I think, thank you very much. It was a really informative presentation. And what I took away from that, one of the things that made the most impact for me was the importance of including your supply chain and what an important component your supply chain is to your overall greenhouse gas emissions. I think most AusLSA members are used to reporting on a set of data that we have good access to and good control over, and we're actually getting quite effective at managing those. But the things that are beyond our management and control are actually those scope 3 emissions, which are going to be a real challenge for us to deal with.
Yes.
I also got I was really quite amazed with the actual importance of reducing your emissions as well as offsetting your emissions in a program like a net zero emissions. So it's not just about potentially buying offsets to pay for our sins or to kind of to sort of wash those away, that you've actually got to do some deeper payment, which is going to require some real change, not just sort of some tinkering around the edges. So, but also offsets, there's some complexity, a lot of complexity, not just about availability, but about quality, about longevity. So there's a lot for law firms actually. It's not a simple kind of thing to manage, is it? It's a hugely complex area. But that doesn't take away from the importance of managing. It just means that you're not just going to be able to get away with a simple program that's going to actually make much change or have much effect.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for that. We might go onto the chat and get into some questions. I've got quite a few, but I better prioritise the participants' questions. So I'll just go into as they've come in. I'll just go into it. So the first one is there any really good examples of sustainable procurement policies, and does anyone have used software or a service that provides more information to identify sustainable options? Have you seen some great leading sustainable supply chain management that helps firms navigate and get to more sustainable supply options?
Yeah, I have. Walmart is kind of the poster child for sustainable procurement, but obviously they're in a totally different space. They're buying goods from people, so it's very important those goods are represented in a sustainable way. So, but I think you can take components of that. Sorry, can everyone hear me? I'm on mic, so that's yeah, I think that there is examples out there of, and it's mainly in those sort of the sort of retail and wholesale space that they're doing it. As I mentioned before, people like Google and Amazon, Microsoft, Apple are doing a lot of work in that area as well, particularly mainly around modern slavery and sort of areas. But it does translate as well into environmental impacts. In terms of software solutions, yeah, not so much. I think that it's something that's it's quite qualitative and difficult to have metrics on. So it's hard to sort of push data into a system that will give you those outcomes and metrics. But it's certainly something that would be worth pursuing from that perspective.
Yeah, certainly from the climate action piece, you've got to know, if you've got a target in tonnes, then you've got to know what your supply chain is doing in tonnes as well. So that's quite a qualitative piece. Yeah. Thanks very much. Another question here about recycling targets and waste management in firms. In terms of cleaning and waste contracts and potentially contracts with a landlord, for example, who might provide those services, would it be up to the client to kind of negotiate to reduce that non-recyclable content or set targets, or to help? Have you seen some examples of how law firms have worked with either their cleaning contractors or their base building suppliers, their landlords, on waste management?
Yeah, absolutely. Barangaroo's a good example there. So Lendlease have been very proactive in terms of their contractors and who they work with, and making sure that they have commitment to not only separating the waste streams but dealing with them in a sustainable way. So I guess it depends, like a lot of sustainable procurement or supplier engagement, depends on how much weight you can have. So as I mentioned before, a lot of organisations are in multi-storey office buildings where they don't have a direct connection to the waste contract provider. It's often a base building service that's incorporated as part of your lease. So that can be difficult to make direct actions there, but it's certainly something you can act on at that sort of local level, making sure that there's bins available for people to use and disaggregate waste at that level before it gets triggered.
Excellent. So there's another question here about supply chain policies as well, and I imagine then the templates that would actually be used to manage those. So we'll follow those. We'll follow those up, and it's a great future presentation idea to get someone. And I imagine there's some domestic ones. Your Coles and Woolworths are developing that area. I know Bunnings, different types of products, but the process is important. Yeah. Maybe if I could ask you a couple of questions. So the first one, you mentioned in terms of the programs, and two of the most programs that we hear a lot about are the Climate Active program, which is an Australian government program, and then we're hearing a lot recently about net zero or science-based target initiative, science-based targets, net zero kind of approach. They both seem to require you to improve your efficiency and to reduce direct emissions, as well as potentially buying offsets in the near. How would you contrast those two programs? And is it, in terms of if a law firm is looking to start somewhere, is there a kind of a way to start with a type of program and still have net zero as a medium to longer term ambition?
Yeah, and I think that's the main differentiation between them. Climate active is something you can basically do now, as long as you've got the numbers and you've got the offsets, you should be okay to get certified. And that, as I mentioned, that can be seen as an annual commitment to this longer term target of net zero eventually, with your absolute emissions as much as you can, and compensated for those residual emissions that are left over. So I think that's the primary distinction between the two. And I think, Climate Active are looking at various other types of certification. That we're looking at doing 100% renewable certification as well. The property sector, they're looking at the embodied carbon in materials and construction. So yeah, I think it'll be something that evolves over time and gradually improves and aligns more with those science-based trajectories.
So you get a sense that there's a real kind of ramping up of the development of some of these programs to catch up as well. So there's not only new programs evolving, but the existing programs are kind of increasing the level of support tools and scrutiny around.
That's right. Yeah, well. Absolutely. Yeah.
And maybe just see if there's any more questions in the chat. No.
There's one more question in the chat.
One more question, which there's one just arrived. Sorry, Marcus, have you?
It's Jim's question.
Jim Pierce's question about sustainable supply chain policies.
Sorry. 1251.
Okay. Yep. So we've got a question here that says CEOs like targets and stretch targets, but not ones that carry any kind of reputational risk. So there's a kind of a friction there, isn't there? That it's important to have targets, and we don't know how we're going to meet some of these sort of stretch targets. But they actually obviously don't want to have the reputational risk of doing that. How would you recommend law firms could structure a target to kind of deal with some of those things? How do you focus on only short term? Can we only focus on a short term target if senior executive are worried about longer term targets without a clear pathway?
Yeah, well, as I highlighted in those programs and frameworks that are available, there are pledges available, so you can sort of say, okay, we're pledging to this, we want to be part of this movement, we're committed to action, and we're going to do it in a stepwise fashion. So, like I said, it's a big call to have a science-based target in place and to be able to actually deliver on that. So there is a reputational risk there. So another pathway might be to say, we agree with the principles of being in line with climate science, and we are going to do our best to make a reduction that's in line with that, and we're going to annually report and be very transparent about how we're doing that. So I think that's the key, is being as robust and transparent as you can in what you're measuring and how you're measuring it, and what actions you're taking for the long term to meet those targets.
Yeah, it's really kind of untying your boat when you can't see over the horizon where your destination is, and just having faith that when you get there, you'll find a destination. But that's a kind of a risky.
Lawyers don't like that.
They don't like that. That's right. There is some conflict there as well. I like the as an example, I like that slide you had of the pathway. So a firm has said, and that wasn't a 2050 pathway, it's only a 2030 pathway, but it still showed, if we're going to get there, here are the things we're going to need to chip away at, and here's how we're going to have to perform in each of these areas. And if we do all these things, then we're going to get to where we want to go. That's possibly easier to do for 7 years, 6 years, and 8 years, than it is for 25. It's a really interesting kind of process. How do you assume that you'll find solutions as you go?
Well, and also I think you need to take into account those external factors that are going to happen at the same time as that. So there's greening of the grid, as I mentioned. So there's this assumption that the economy as a whole will decarbonise at a certain rate as well. So that will impact your suppliers and your operations. So it's important to sort of keep that in mind as you build out those pathways and roadmaps.
Yeah, and it's fair to say in any long-term strategic plan, they're full of assumptions. But last night's budget full of assumptions. There's a whole lot of assumptions that we make. Clearly, the assumptions about where climate's heading, where the economy's heading, and a whole lot of infrastructure issues that will help you reach those targets, where sustainable travel is heading. They're all assumptions we've got to make, and some of those assumptions are that in the next 25 years there will be some solutions that we can take advantage of.
That's right.
So I thought that pathway was a really good way to approach it, because they chipped away at the sorts of things they could do. They set some interim kind of finer targets on different aspects of their thing and demonstrated how they could get to that short-term 2030 target.
Yeah.
What was we're out of time, so I'm going to just close this off. Please, if you have any other questions for Chris, or if you'd like to speak to Chris offline, stay on the chat. We'll keep that open and talk to whoever's still here. Otherwise, please stay tuned for further climate action webinars as they come through. We'll be really drilling into some technical issues in a lot more depth in future ones. I hope you'll find that useful in future. So thanks very much to all the attendees. Thank you so much for Chris for your time and effort. We're very lucky to be able to get you for this part of the process, and thank you very much for Clayton Utes, who hosted us today, one of our executive members. It makes running these processes very easy. Thanks everyone. I'm not going to close the meeting just so we can keep the chat going. So if anyone, just mention in your chat if you'd like to kind of just have a bit of a conversation, we can turn your camera and microphone on if you'd like to do that. So just let us know in the chat and we'll get you all mic'd up. I think we're dropping away. There's a few people still hanging on, so just let us know if you'd like us to unmute you, or if you've got any questions you'd like to put into chat. Okay, I'm going to unmute Louise. So Eloise, you're on the air.
Hi.
Oh, hang on, but I haven't got any sound. Just a moment, sorry. Can you hear us, Eloise, okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
I didn't really have anything to add. I just sort of wanted to pick up on Susan's point around what that definition of net zero looks like, because I do think that as an industry, it would be good for us to adopt a position on that.
Yeah, well, certainly we've had a discussion at the board level for AusLSA. I mean, it'd be very interesting to see what a mechanism would be to kind of adopt an industry kind of wide position, but I think it's a very interesting conversation to have at the kind of the AusLSA board level to see whether AusLSA can come up with a position. When we last discussed it, it was over 6 months ago. I would argue that things have changed a lot even in that last 6 months in terms of what we would recommend to law firms going best practice.
The corporate net zero standard only came out in October last year, so that my understanding is that's the first time there's been a definition, a proper definition of what true net zero is.
That's right. It's a very fast moving, as you say, very fast moving area. So are you, Marcus, you able to unmute Susan?
Yes, she should be able to unmute herself now.
You should be able to unmute yourself now, Susan. Yeah, look, absolutely. So I think that's something important to do, and also to have conversations with perhaps some of the law societies to see whether there's other representative bodies that have a role in the legal sector about whether they would adopt a position. Do you kind of have anything in mind in terms of a vehicle for an industry position?
I guess I was just thinking from, perhaps a statement from the board on what it means. I mean, you've got the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance in the UK that pre the SBTI corporate net zero standard had adopted sort of a position around a 50% reduction across the 3 scopes by 2030 as a sort of minimum. So I feel like we could probably do something like that. And obviously my preference, because the direction we're going is science-based targets, I'd like to see it aligned with what the standard says. And in terms of other industry groups, I absolutely think we do need to be bringing law societies and others along, because I think there's going to be a lot of pressure that needs to be brought to bear on the courts, for example, because there are certain emissions in our scope 3, our printing and couriers and travel and various things that are related to litigation and, you know, how paper intensive it is and, you know, need to be physically in a courtroom versus doing things online.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So courts, you wouldn't sort of see them as a typical supplier, but we could see most of our scope 3 coming from suppliers. But there's other, whether they even come into that scope thing, there's still an influencer, and there's still someone who can help drive change in the sector. So I've made a note of that, and maybe we can get someone from courts to help. Well, find out. Is there a peak body for courts?
Probably Attorney General's.
Attorney General's office.
I think they fall under AGs in most states.
Yeah, I just get a sense, because we've run a paper program with the Land and Environment Court for New South Wales, so we've kind of had a bit of a, but in running that program, we kind of get a sense of what we'd have to deal with each court independently rather than kind of deal with Attorney Generals. But it'd be great to talk to the Attorney General's department about what whether they could even come up with a position, even if it wasn't just, you know, even if it wasn't them driving it, they could at least come up with a position on it.
I think one of the things that's confused this, sorry, it's Susan here, is that even the IPCC defines both carbon neutral and net zero the same way. In fact, for net zero, it says see carbon neutral. Like, so that's not really very helpful in this context. So I'm wondering how many other firms are actually reading it the wrong way, and these commitments that we're seeing of like 2030 for net zero are actually carbon neutral by then, rather than truly net zero, and that it's a definitional issue rather than, because like, you know, Elle and I have talked about this offline, that we just don't know how they're going to be able to go net zero by 2030. I seriously question whether you can, just because of flights alone. Like,
yeah, no, it's absolutely, Susan, that's very true. I mean, a lot of our clients are starting to get a bit caught out that way, saying they've got a net zero commitment within a very short time frame. Realising what it actually means, something quite different to what they thought.
Interesting enough, I think that perhaps the add-on to that is now we're talking about science-based targets for net zero rather than just net zero by itself. And so putting the science-based targets kind of initiative bit inside it, there's already a standard for that now. So that actually does put some shape around what that means. Sure. But it doesn't mean you can't just use net zero without that. But I think people are more talking about now a science-based target initiative-based program, which has a standard, and now I think it has its first certification program in the UK where you can get certified to it. So there'll be lots of, I imagine there's capability already from, you know, consultancies that can give you some sort of assurance on the meeting of that standard outside of that certification as well. So I think probably that's the thing, perhaps what is net zero. I think it probably means a science-based target. That's probably where you need to go.
I remember we had a bit of a conversation before online. Sorry, because Marcus from Clayton Utte's sort of an unencumbered voice. But talking about, you know, with flights and things like that, and you were saying under science-based targets, I believe if the, say, Qantas offsets the flights by using carbon credits, as long as they're doing the offsetting and it's not us doing the offsetting as a law firm, that would still be counted under science-based targets? No,
they still need to be reducing their emissions, absolutely.
Okay.
But at least they are on the right pathway. So under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, you can identify where the emissions are coming from in your supply chain. If those suppliers have their own target, then you incorporate that into your target as well. So they would still need to have that requirement of not relying on offsets eventually.
So, because I know some of the big accounting firms, so I think KPMG and maybe I can't remember if it's EY or PwC have set science-based targets. And so with their scope 3, they're kind of doing the push down to make sure that their suppliers have science-based targets.
That's right.
Is that, I mean, is that enough? Because, you know, that the supplier has a science-based target that you can then go, well, then that means for 2050, because they've got the science-based targets, we'll be able to be in line.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the idea. But, you know, I guess there's questions there around the validity of that and keeping them in line, which is why it's important to have a policy in place, making sure that
Marcus.
risks are being addressed.
Sorry, it's just
Hi,
Eloise. I was just going to say on that was a bit of a shock to me too, as a climate active organisation, when we first did the net zero modelling for the firm. And so the advice we were given was, you know, if we've got suppliers that are already, you know, maybe have no scope 1, or if they're renewable, so no scope 2, we might be able to, so we're actually looking at surveying people and seeing who already is in that category and sort of making that like the initial step, as well as encouraging people to set targets around their scope 3 emissions aligned with SBTI.
Yeah.
And you're doing that through your procurement process, are you, Eloise?
Yeah, so we're starting by looking at, we haven't settled on a percentage, but it'll be, you know, let's just say our top maybe 100 by spend. So we might survey them or actively go out and try and talk to our account managers and find out who is already renewable, because I think there's probably already people in our supply chain that are, or that have a percentage of renewable energy. So we just want to get a sense of where they're at. And then the first step for us will be to encourage every supplier, or potentially to set a requirement around being renewable or progressing towards that, as well as addressing scope 3. But we just felt like moving to renewable energy is such an for me, that's the low hanging fruit in the.
It's actually, yeah, it's more cost effective than buying offsets.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that the things that you measure are partly about how important they are to measure in terms of the materiality, but it's also about how
much action,
how you can measure.
Yeah.
You can't, you know, things might be really material, but if there's no mechanism to kind of come up with a rigorous way of measuring them, then it's pretty hard to include them.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mentioned before about food and the intricacies there, and the differentiation between using a dollar value coming from the top down, measuring it bottom up, essentially life cycle assessment. There's a lot of challenges there, and it can be a very costly exercise. Because
if you're just measuring spend, for example, and trying to develop a profile for your scope 3 out of spend, it's very hard to measure reduction, isn't it?
That's
because
right.
the spend's going to stay the same.
Yeah.
But you might have, that's right, but you might have preferable suppliers from a climate perspective. But hopefully the data gets better over time. That there's more data available and there's systems to do that.
Michael's got their hand up, so I've allowed them mic. So if you just want to let them know, they can unmute themselves.
Michael, you should be able to. Oh, you've probably heard that, Michael Foley. You can unmute yourself and you have the floor.
I did. Thanks, Richard. And thanks, Chris, for a great presentation. Just had a question in terms of next steps around identifying and endorsing suppliers that meet some of the most common larger transactions that law firms have. And what I'm thinking about that is like either catering or even office moves, where you have a large embedded carbon component of office fit out. I was just wondering, you know, in terms of finding ways to do those services in a more environmentally friendly, rather than individually everyone going out and trying to source that information themselves.
Yeah, so what we're working with a number of our clients in various other industries at the moment is essentially a risk assessment of suppliers. So putting them on a kind of a matrix of likelihood and impact. So, you know, some suppliers are more exposed to risks in the carbon economy than others. But I think that's an important sort of mapping exercise to undertake first, and then you can sort of generate, you know, a goal and target and try and sort of as Eloise mentioned, get those quick wins early in terms of renewables, and then drill down into more detailed emission profiles like embodied emissions in office fit outs, etc.
So that general risk matrix potentially wouldn't help you differentiate between suppliers providing the same service, because they'd be in the same part of that matrix, wouldn't they?
Well, but they might be providing the same service, but they might be more exposed to risk because they haven't done anything about their emissions so far, or they haven't measured it.
Oh, so that they could move within that risk matrix.
Yeah, so the questions send out a questionnaire to suppliers. Have you done this? Have you done that? If they haven't, then they're more exposed to that risk. If they're making a commitment to do it in, say, 5 years' time, eventually they're going to mitigate that risk.
Yeah.
And you can sort of bring them down the scale.
So it's kind of like a little bit of a sort of a self-declared kind of pre-qualification. Have you got renewable energy? Yes, no. Have you got an environmental management system? Yes, no. Do you have targets for 5 years? Yes, no. Do you have 2050 data? Yes, no. So whilst it might not be quantitative, it could potentially lead to quantitative stuff down the track.
That's right.
Very interesting.
It is subjective, but it is something that at least gives you a feel for where people are.
Susan's got a hand up.
Susan, you had the floor.
Thank you. Can I just go back to something that Chris touched on just a little earlier? So are you saying that with the flights, that if Qantas or whoever, I think British Airways make all their flights carbon neutral now, don't they? So you can't use that in your science-based target. Like I can't use it for KWM. If we were to use all British Airways flights, I wouldn't be able to say that all our flights have zero emissions because they've basically used offsets to do that.
You can use it for climate active, but not for.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but I have actually been told by another consultant that you can use it. So just like word to the wise, just be careful of what you might be getting told as well and whether it's true, because it just sounded wrong to me, and I've been meaning to contact SBT about it to check, but yeah.
Science-based target is a science-based target, and you can't use offsets. As I mentioned, there's that taxonomy of offsets. If they are potentially using long-term storage and removal, then maybe, but it's highly unlikely that they are.
And do you know if, you mentioned before that Qantas, well, I don't know if you mentioned Qantas by name, but I know Qantas have been doing some sustainable aviation fuel trials and everything.
Yeah.
Are they going to be able to give data to allow us to use those, to sort of show those flights separately as being lower emissions flights? Because at the moment we sort of, like, we use the CTM reporting.
Generic.
And if you're plugging it into climate active or whatever, they've just got these standard sort of emissions factors. But ideally, we, if we were to say, right, well, we're going to mandate all Qantas flights because they're using this 10% sustainable aviation fuel, then we want to be able to sort of reflect that. So, do you know, is that being worked on? The aviation industry.
I can't speak for Qantas specifically, but you'd assume that that's something that they would want to give and something that people will be asking for. And just going back to that supplier engagement piece, that's something that you want to be asking people for, because you might be using, as you say, generic industry level emission factors. You want to get more nuanced with that and more detail and more bottom up. So you actually want to know what their emissions are, what their emission profile is, not what the National Carbon Accounts or DEFRA or whoever says that.
I wonder if that's something we could do as an industry, because I mean, we would be a reasonably large user of flights across, if we multiplied ourselves across the whole of the legal industry, to actually go to the big companies and say, well, we want more granular information. Like, is that something that's worth us doing as a group?
Yeah, I've made a note that there's an opportunity to try and get some sort of pre-qualified information from potentially suppliers. So whether we came up with a questionnaire or a request for information that helped you get the information that was useful and available, absolutely we can develop that as a group. I think going to individual suppliers as a group, I don't know. I think that we should discuss that more, but there's definitely some opportunities to streamline how we ask for information, so we get the most useful information available.
Well, I think a similar approach could be used for renewables as well. What we're finding is a lot of corporates are ganging up together, so they have that economy of scale, and they have the demand that will actually make project developers pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
So if you all go in and say, this is our consolidated energy usage, it's a good deal, they'll come to the party. But if you do it on your own, it won't be such an easy.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Jim had his hand up.
Yeah, Jim, sorry, you've been very patient. Thanks for waiting.
No worries. Yeah, thanks. It's Jim from Cause here. So just, I guess it's on the same line as the last question there, but so when you like purchase $1 million worth of printers or something, I think the capex cost is like a flat carbon rate in the way it's assessed. But if you go and buy those from an organisation that's got commitments for science-based targets, or they've got a sustainability policy and all their factories use green electricity, does that then change your spend assessment on that? So instead of it being, I don't know, whatever it is for $1 million, it's less?
You wouldn't be, you'd change it to an activity based. So you'd say, okay, we're purchasing this many units, the supplier, and the emissions intensity of that unit is X. Therefore, our emissions are Y, rather than just having that top-down spend analysis. You know, if the supplier can give you that data.
So the supplier got to give you that, like the carbon cost of supplying you that printer, for instance.
That's right. Yeah, and that's essentially what you're doing when, you know, its Cause is a carbon neutral service, as a legal service. You're saying that the carbon intensity of our services to our clients is this much. So that's saying the people who utilise your services that that's the multiplier that they need to use. It's the same scenario.
That sort of makes sense, but if in this sense that Cause supplies its services as carbon neutral, the way we do that is we pay Climate Active an extra chunk of money. So how does that work? Because people say it's a rort.
Well, no. But what we've done is the way we've come up with that is through a functional unit of billable hours. So that's how we assigned your total emissions to functional unit. And that functional unit gets used as a multiplier by the people who use your services. So same goes for a product. If, you know, Dell computers say this is the carbon intensity of one of our laptops, then you can use that as saying, okay, we buy 200 of those laptops, therefore our carbon footprint from that purchase is this.
So the short answer, if you've got better data than the financial data to assess carbon, then you can use it. But I think your point is, Jim, well, we're making an assumption that the supplier will be able to provide good information about the carbon intensity, and at the moment we're not seeing a lot of that data coming through.
No, that's right.
Yeah. So I mean,
for the future.
Yeah, you know, Canon could say we've paid extra money to get the services supplied as carbon neutral, and then
it's more than the extra license fee though. It's coming up with methodology and publicly stating what that is.
I did have a second question, which is just around platforms, and it's more of an information thing. So we have been using a company called Inform 365 for modern slavery as a platform to send out questionnaires and sort of manage the supply chain. And I kind of see this sort of sitting in the same boat, in that you're going to form questionnaires to a proportion of our supply chain to understand where they are with their carbon neutral status and science-based targets and net zero commitments and so on, to be able to make an assessment of where we are right now, and then as we go forward, changing our supply standards to sort of be more favourable towards those companies that are on the same pathway. So, yeah, is there? Are there other platforms out there as well that organisations are using? It's more of an open question.
Look, I think there's the Inform 365 example for modern slavery, and they do have a broader sustainable procurement tool that kind of goes along the same sort of lines. But what we're seeing is that the large kind of platforms for sustainable procurement are being developed in-house by the likes of Goldeneye and Bunnings. They're doing their own work. There's been a lot of collaboration going on in terms of sharing data and sharing information about this. I guess the only benefit is potentially where they use similar suppliers and they're more kind of experienced in responding and providing the information that's required. So yeah, look, I'm not aware of too many more. There's not a sort of an association of sustainable procurement people in Australia, but I can get the supply chain sustainability school potentially to I can ask them the question, and maybe they could even present to this group about how we might use supply chain methodologies to kind of get better carbon information from this as well. The modern slavery approach is a really good, I think, case study of how you can manage a sustainable procurement aspect, and in this case it's modern slavery and human rights, but the same kind of approach applies to kind of anything, whether it be carbon, whether it be other human rights issues, whether it be biodiversity, use anything like that. So I'll make a note as a priority for a future roundtable delve into.
Richard, there's EcoVadis and EcoBuy as well, but I don't know too much about them yet and how good they are in this area.
Yeah, EcoBuy is a very old local government program that really is kind of doesn't really operate anymore. Still doing a few things with a couple of local governments, but it's not doing anything outside of local government. It's actually run from Ernst & Young now. EcoVadis, I thought, was a sustainability kind of certification.
Yeah, it's more environmental management.
Yeah, but they may have a sustainable supply chain module, but they're international, I think, not local. And yeah, we could certainly have a bit of a conversation about that and include potentially someone from a Coles or a Bunnings and also someone from Inform 365 to talk through exactly how their tool might be built.
Yeah, that'd be good, because I know, like, I've been on an EcoVadis kind of like seminar type of thing, which was really a bit of a sales pitch. And I know, you know, we've been asked before to divulge information to it, but it's kind of like a two-way thing, that you can be a reporter, but you can also be a user of that data as well. So, and I haven't had a chance to really look into it much myself yet, but it would be worth finding out whether it would help
Susan,
this industry.
I can talk to EcoVadis because we've done the assessment.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably not, I don't think it, like, it was useful. It was a lot of like submitting documents about policies, and then they sort of just rate how you're going based on the processes and the policies that you have in place. And it's across all of your sustainability metrics. I'm not sure how useful it would be for this. I'm actually testing something called SEDEX at the moment, which is another supply chain thing. I'm testing it as a supplier, but it's a two-way thing. So you can be registered as a supplier or as a buyer. It's pretty detailed. It's also international, so a lot of the terminology is just not quite suited to our industry or Australia. And it's also, I think, tailored more to multinationals that have certain tiers of like management in terms of the types of reporting you might do on labour issues.
Yeah. Okay.
And my feeling is, I haven't fully explored it yet, but I do want to go and see how many multinationals are using it, because, you know, everyone would have had the experience with modern slavery of sending your modern slavery questionnaire to Microsoft and Dell and Amazon and just like no response because they're not going to. But I suspect some of them may be on these platforms, potentially on EcoVadis, potentially SEDEX, but it is in no way going to be helpful for like medium. You couldn't put an SME on it. They would just freak out. And yeah, I am yet to find that platform, but I'm very interested in what else is out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thanks, Phil.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks very much for staying on. These are really interesting conversations, and it kind of tells me that part of the value about doing these things is having the opportunity to have these conversations at the end. So we'll certainly build this in as at the end of everyone. Please, at the end of every roundtable, we'll have a bit of a spillover group. But thanks very much. And I've made some really good notes. I'm looking forward to sort of pulling that together into a bit of a program and organising the next session shortly. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone, thanks
Yes.
very much.
Bye for now.